Now, as I mentioned to you last week in passing, in the summer of 1862, prior to this Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln got his cabinet together, and he told his cabinet that he was considering issuing this proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation. But they all decided it would be much better if he waited until a military victory by the Union, because they had been getting spanked in like every single battle they had been in. And the feeling was, if you announce the Emancipation Proclamation before a victory in battle, you're going to look desperate and weak. So they wanted a victory. Now, the thing about this is kind of interesting. This proclamation will eventually free the slaves in the states that seceded from the Union. Okay, it's going to free the slaves in the states that seceded from the Union. What doesn't it mention? Ones what? Well, especially which ones that are technically still in the Union. The border states. It doesn't mention anything about slavery in the border states. So keep in mind when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, this is only going to free slaves in the states that seceded from the Union. The border states, it doesn't mention. However, most border states that stayed neutral were not slave-owning states. But just keep in mind it said that, okay? So, after this victory at Antietam, Lincoln felt that was the victory that he needed to officially announce this Emancipation Proclamation. So, on January 1st of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln officially issues the Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And what did that do again? It officially ended slavery in what? Yeah, Confederate states, or states that seceded from the Union. Now, other than freeing the slaves, Lincoln really wanted to accomplish two things by this Emancipation Proclamation. And we've already talked about one. Anybody remember what one reason why he signed it? To free the slaves?
So then you get foreign help?
Right. He wanted to keep France and Great Britain out of the war, because France and Great Britain were willing to help the Confederate cause when it came to states' rights, or the rights to govern yourself. But if the South kept fighting after the Emancipation Proclamation, what are they fighting for in essence? Slavery. And neither France nor Great Britain was going to contribute to a fight to enslave people. So that was brilliant on Lincoln's part to pass the Emancipation Proclamation for that purpose. But he also had another underlying purpose in doing this. Anybody remember the political party Lincoln belongs to? He is used to be, there's no longer in existence. You got two choices. He's a Republican, okay? Now, it just so happened, fortunately for him, in most cases, Congress was controlled by the Republican Party. The problem for Lincoln was they had a large majority of the Republicans in Congress that were considered radical Republicans, who did not approve of the way Lincoln was handling this Civil War. They were very much against slavery. The radical Republicans hated slavery. And so one of the other major reasons why Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation is to get those radical Republicans off of his back, because he had officially freed the slaves. Now, this is kind of a double-edged sword. The radical Republicans are going to come back into history and be a real pain in the neck. Would have been for Lincoln, but because of Lincoln's assassination, which we'll talk about, Andrew Johnson, who will succeed Lincoln to the presidency, is going to have all kinds of trouble with the radical Republicans. Because Lincoln's plan for the South after the Civil War and Johnson's plan, which were the same, the radical Republicans really felt was too weak. They were too easy on the South. These guys wanted revenge. Okay, and they wanted slaves freed, they wanted slaves educated for their life and normality. And so the radical Republicans come back later. And basically what you had in Congress at this time is the Republicans control Congress. Well, within that Republican control, the radical Republicans outnumbered the moderate Republicans by quite a bit. So you have a really radical Congress at this point. And they're giving Lincoln the business, or on his back. And so to get him off his back, he passes the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees the slaves, which is their biggest argument. Okay? They won't go away, however. Now, as I mentioned, both France and Great Britain were willing to help the South concerning the issue of states' rights, but with the freeing of the slaves in the South, the Confederates now would be fighting for slavery, and neither foreign country wanted any part of that. So the big question is, hey, Mr. Durr, after the Emancipation Proclamation, did any of these former slaves fight on the side of the Union? Approximately 180,000 did. So approximately 180,000 former slaves would pick up arms and fight on the Union side in the Civil War. About 180,000. How do you think they dealt with these how do you think they dealt with these colored troops? They segregated them. No one wanted to fight side by side with the Negro if you were a white. They didn't want to do that. So they segregated them. Okay? And they segregated them into what they called the United States Colored Troops.
Would the radical Republicans, were they in favor of that?
No, I think they thought they should be equal. But I tell you, this is really a good comment, Izzy, because my dad, rest his soul, fought in the Korean War in the 50s, 1950s. You think he wanted any part with bunking with the Negro? He called it worse than that? No. I'll tell you, we'll kind of hit that, but no, they wanted him freed, but they weren't quite equal. You know what I mean? We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, these black soldiers that were segregated into what was called the United States Colored Troops got the nickname Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers. So these blacks, former slaves that fought for the Union, were put into segregated troops called the United States Colored Troops, and they were also referred to as Buffalo Soldiers. Now, Sage, who do you think commanded these Buffalo Soldiers? Who were their commanders or officers? I mean, not specific names, but who do you think led them? 99 kids out of 100 will say just what Sage said. Well, they're segregated, so they're going to be commanded by black people. No, they were commanded by white officers. Everybody says that. Because they didn't have any confidence that blacks were smart enough to lead themselves. Okay? That was one reason, right? Now, I'm going to tell you a story, which is way off cuff, and you're going to see this before the year's out. I'm going to show you a video of Football Life on Doug Williams. Does anybody in the world in here know who Doug Williams is? Anybody heard of Doug Williams? Well, Doug Williams was a Super Bowl winning quarterback for the Washington Redskins in the 80s and 90s. What was his story? Why would I show you that? What's that got to do with this? He was a starting quarterback in the NFL in the 80s and 90s. What was unusual about Doug Williams?
He was black.
He was black. And even in the 80s and 90s, 25, 30 years ago, we didn't have confidence that you could have a black quarterback in the NFL because they weren't smart enough. I'm not kidding you. Had no black coaches in the NFL because they weren't smart enough to be leaders. Matter of fact, in 2019, of all the coaching openings they had in the NFL, you know how many black coaches got hired? One. He was a defensive coach for the Patriots who took over for the Miami Dolphins. They have a rule in the NFL in 2019 called the Rooney Rule that says that you are required to interview so many black candidates if you have a head coaching job. We're in 2018 and we still really don't know if blacks are intelligent enough to coach. I mean, it's crazy. But that's the philosophy back here. Doug Williams was a quarterback, the black quarterback who actually became a starting quarterback when people thought black quarterbacks could never be smart enough. Same thing, it goes all the way back Civil War with these colored troops. They didn't think they were bright enough to lead themselves. So they had white commanders. That's crazy, but that's the way it is today. Okay? Now, let me ask you a question, Regan. If you were a Buffalo soldier and you were fighting in the Civil War and you got captured by the Confederates, what might you expect? Worse. Well, I don't know if it'd be worse or not. They either killed them on the spot or burned them to death on the spot. That was their revenge for you leaving and fighting for the other side. So, a Buffalo soldier who would be captured by Confederates during the Civil War could expect to be shot on sight or burnt alive. Now, Sager, how about those white commanders? What would happen if you were commanding black troops and you got captured? What might they do? They do the same, girl. They do the same thing to you. That's how much anger was in the Confederacy on this Emancipation Proclamation. So if you were a Buffalo soldier or a white leader, white officer of Buffalo soldier troops, you would be shot on sight or burned. Now, if you're interested in this, and you have nothing to do on a Saturday night, because according to teenagers in Worland, there's nothing to do on a Saturday night, get on Netflix and watch the movie Glory. It's a perfect example of black troops in the Civil War commanded by white officers. Denzel Washington stars in it when he was a young actor, Morgan Freeman. Now, some of the kids in the other class said that you actually watched this in 8th grade. You remember it? Yeah. Well, if you get bored, watch it. It's really, if you're interested in this, it's about a black regiment who fights in the Civil War and their ultimate demise. It's a pretty good movie, okay? Got some good actors. Any questions on the Emancipation Proclamation? Okay? Then we'll move to our last subtopic of this test material, which is the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Now, if you want to, just note that I'll give you a new ID sheet when we get to part 2. So you can put this particular ID sheet in with part 1 and we'll move on after we're done here. Okay, it's got some of the things, but I made a couple changes. So anyway, we'll talk about the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Now, this is kind of interesting. Even though General McClellan led Union forces to a victory at Antietam, President Lincoln still wasn't sold on it. So he again replaced McClellan with a new overall commander. This time it was General Ambrose Burnside. So again, disappointed with the leadership of General McClellan. Even though he got a victory at Antietam, President Lincoln replaced him again, this time with General Ambrose Burnside. Had quite a few changes, haven't we? How many times have the Confederates changed? None, right? Now, once Ambrose Burnside became overall commander, he decided that he was again going to make a move on Richmond, Virginia. In order to make a move on Richmond, Virginia, they would have to defeat Confederate forces at Fredericksburg, Virginia. And the goal was to beat the Confederates at Fredericksburg and then march on to Richmond and end this doggone war once and forever. So the Union plan under General Burnside was to attack the Confederates near Richmond at Fredericksburg, Virginia, and then secure a victory at Fredericksburg and advance directly to the Confederate capital of Richmond and end the war once and for all. So, on December 13th of 1862, December 13th of 1862, General Ambrose Burnside led his Union troops on a frontal attack of the Confederate Army at Fredericksburg. On December 13th, 1862, General Burnside led his Union troops on a frontal attack against the Confederacy at Fredericksburg. What's a frontal attack? Anybody know? It's pretty self-explanatory, but formation-wise, what are you doing if you're leading your men into a frontal attack? What are you doing, formation-wise? Think back to the Revolutionary War. And take in consideration that Burnside is an old-fashioned commander. What's it mean, frontal attack? What do you think, Jonathan? straight in. You're in perfect columns, and you're marching straight in to the Confederate army. Well, the Confederates didn't know anything about these rules of war that we had during international conflicts. And so the Confederates weren't lined up in perfect formation firing back like we saw in the Revolution. They actually hid behind rocks and trees and tree stumps and any other unseen areas and fired at will at Burnside's troops as they marched in strict formation straight into the Confederate lines. So again, Burnside's leading his troops on a frontal attack against the Confederacy at Fredericksburg. The Union soldiers are marching in strict formation towards the Confederate soldiers who were firing from behind rocks, trees, tree stumps, any other unseen areas. And in a very short period of time, Burnside lost over 12,000 Union soldiers killed or wounded. They were just massacred, basically. It's a horrible loss for the Union. 12,000. 12,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded in a very short battle at Fredericksburg. So, Danny, considering the time of this battle, I don't mean tick-tock, I mean date, what do you think both the North and the South do after the Battle of Fredericksburg? What's the date that they fought? Very good, my dear. They stopped for the winter. So after the Battle of Fredericksburg, both the North and the South simply took positions close to their capitals and dug in for the winter. There wasn't any fighting again until the spring. And when we get to the spring of 1863, we'll be talking about the Battle of Chancellorsville, which is next, okay? So, by the end of the Battle of Fredericksburg, it's getting close to winter. Both sides head back to their capitals and dig in for the winter. In the spring of 1863, we will have another battle between North and South at Chancellorsville. Well, what do you think Lincoln does before the Battle of Chancellorsville? Changes commanders again. And he changes from Ambrose Burnside to General Joe Hooker. I'll just give you a little prelude to next test material. At the end of this deal, at the end of the Battle of Chancellorsville, guess who wants to be overall commander of the Union? Nobody. It's a job nobody wants. And it's going to be assigned to a guy by the name of George Meade, who's going to be very surprised that he gets the job, and then he's going to lead the Union to a big-time victory at Gettysburg. But anyway, nobody wants the job after this particular battle we're talking about. So, Joe Hooker is named overall commander of Union forces in the spring of 1863. And he again is going to try to lead the Union to a victory at Richmond. This time they're going to engage Confederates at Chancellorsville, Virginia. Now this is kind of interesting. It shows the brilliant strategy of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, even though some people, depending on where you grew up in this country, thought he was on the wrong side. Some people think he was on the absolute right side. But he was a brilliant man at military strategy. Brilliant. I mean, you can't give him enough credit. And this battle is kind of an example. And again, I could teach about the Civil War for 6 months and give you every detail. But at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Joe Hooker has like 130,000 troops that he's marching to Chancellorsville. And Lee has a little less, just a little bit more than half that many. But he's horribly outnumbered. Okay, horribly outnumbered. And so what do you do sometimes when you're horribly outnumbered? If you've got Joe Hooker here with, I mean, all of these troops, and they're coming at you, and you're the Confederates, and you only got this many troops, what's your best way to get a victory? What? Wait, yeah, run, that is not. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? You're going to split in half and send some of them to attack from a different angle, okay? Surprise your enemy. And that's what Lee did. Knowing he was badly outnumbered, Confederate General Lee divided his smaller army into 2 separate units. And this surprised General Hooker because he was expecting all of them in the same place, right? You remember what Andrew Jackson did at Tallapoosa? He attacked from the front, but what did he have around back? All those Indians, right, that were fighting. And he diverted attention to the back and overran the Red Sticks. Well, Lee's going to do the same thing. Who's he going to order to go around the flank and attack from a different direction? Who's going to get that assignment? Just take a guess. He obviously would be a Confederate general. Who do you think? Now, we haven't talked about lately too much, but he's pretty famous. He has a really cool nickname.
Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jackson. So Thomas Stonewall Jackson is ordered by Lee to attack Union General Hooker's troops from a different direction. And he does that, and he takes Hooker by surprise, and all of a sudden he's got to pull men off and engage Jackson and his men. Well, to make a long story short, without going into big detail, because we're not doing that with every battle, just the Antietam and Gettysburg battle. To make a long story short, this strategy works to perfection, and the Confederates again defeat the Union at Chancellorsville. The Confederates again are victorious at Chancellorsville. But the Confederates pay a high price. Which is kind of an interesting story. Anybody do the report on Stonewall Jackson? Nobody in here did? I didn't give anybody here Stonewall Jackson? Maybe I didn't. Huh? You haven't done the Civil War ones yet?
No, we did. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you like.
The last ones he gave us for the Civil War.
Yeah. Who did you do your last report on? Well, listen, we got time, right? I'm just curious now.
The other one that you said we can either do this one or the one this one.
Oh,
Somebody that was on the 10.
okay, perfect. Well, anyway,